So today's episode comes to you courtesy of Liam, who's been supporting this channel as a Golden Pig tier patron. I truly couldn't do this without the support from amazing patrons like Liam, so again, Liam, thank you so much. And for the personalized deck tech, Liam actually chose an underrated commander. And the underrated commander that Liam chose for this episode is Neera Wild Mage, with a focus on Izzet Chaos Spellslinger with some Eldrazi. So, Neera Wild Mage is a 2/7 human elf shaman that costs 4 blue-red. She has, whenever you cast a spell, you may put it on the bottom of its owner's library. If you do, reveal cards from the top of your library to reveal a non-land card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost, then put the rest of the bottom of your library in a random order. This ability triggers only once each turn. So Neera can most definitely be the Queen of Chaos. You can essentially turn one of your tiny spells into something potentially massive. Or, you know, you might whiff. It really depends on what you hit, though of course there are some ways to essentially ensure that you're not going to whiff, and even some ways to essentially determine what you're going to hit. So this commander has a ton of potential and can do some incredible things. And some very chaotic and very spicy things as well. And with that, and with the cards in this episode, every single one of them, including this commander, is less than $1, so it's a very budget-friendly deck. And when going through these cards, I'm going to be taking you through different tactics to show you how this deck works and how we're going to win with it. And with that, if you are interested in this deck, make sure you check out that deck list, link in the description below. And now with all that said, let's jump into it. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 to tap and sacrifice to get a basic land into play tapped. And then we're going to be running Arcane Signet, which can tap for both of our colors, and Instant Signet, which we can pay 1 and 2 to tap for each of them. Next up, we're also going to be running our Talisman with Talisman of Creativity, which can tap for a colorless or tap for one of our 2 colors and deal 1 damage to us. And then Cold Steel Heart's going to enter the battlefield tapped, and when it does so, we choose a color and it can tap for that mana. Prismatic Lens, on the other hand, enters untapped, but only taps for a colorless, or we can utilize it to filter our mana. Next up, we're also going to be utilizing Fire Diamond and Sky Diamond, which each enter the battlefield tapped and tap for one of our 2 colors. And then Everflowing Chalice is a very flexible mana rock that can essentially tap for half the amount of mana that we put into it. And finally, we also have some ramp and reduction cards that can help us with card advantage as well, with cards like Mindstone and Jace's Sanctum. Mindstone we can tap for a color, so we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it to draw a card. Whereas Jace's Sanctum is going to reduce the cost of our instant sorcery spells by 1, and whenever we cast an instant sorcery spell, we scry 1. So this can help us cast more and more spells throughout the game, and of course on top of that, it gives us some fantastic card selection, which of course can be very important in helping us set ourselves up for what we're going to be hitting with our commander's trigger. Speaking of which, we can also utilize other scry effects which come on cards like Crystal Ball and Netherese Puzzle Ward. Crystal Ball is an artifact that has pay 1, tap, scry 2. So again, by having this in play, we can ditch certain cards off the top of our library and put them on the bottom of our library and keep massive cards on top for us to hit. And then Netherese Puzzle Ward says, beginning of your upkeep, roll a d4, scry X for X is the result. And on top of that, if we roll a d4, we get to draw a card. So this can really help us out a lot throughout the game, getting us set up and occasionally drawing us some cards. Next up, Knowledge is Power, so we can utilize cards like Precognition Field, Melik Izzet Paragon, and Future Sight to know what the top of our library is. Precognition Field says you may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may cast the top of your library with an instant or sorcery card, and you can pay 3 to exile the top card of your library. Again, if we know something massive is on top, great, we can cast something to ensure that we hit it. Or if it's an instant or sorcery on top, we can actually cast it from there for some extra card advantage, and if we actually just don't even like the card on top, we can exile it. And then Melik Izzet Paragon is somewhat similar. We put the top card of our library revealed, we can cast instant sorcery spells from the top of our library, and whenever we cast one from there, we copy it. And we can choose new targets for the copy. So yeah, this can provide us a ton of value throughout the game. Speaking of which, there's Future Sight, which lets us play the top card of our library revealed as well, and we can play the top card of our library no matter what it is. So unlike the other two, we are not restricted to just instants and sorceries. And again, in many scenarios, it can definitely be crucial to know what is on top of our library with this commander. But of course, we can also place certain things on top of our library with cards like Brainstorm, Brainstone, and Dream Cache. Brainstorm's gonna have us draw 3 cards and put 2 cards from our hand on top of our library in any order. Whereas Brainstorm basically does the exact same thing, but it's an artifact and we pay 2 to tap and sacrifice it to do so. And then Dream Cache is somewhat different. It says draw 3 cards and put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library or both on bottom of your library. Regardless, each of these have the potential to set ourselves up for a massive play. And really quick, keep in mind how our commander's trigger is worded. First up, it says whenever you cast a spell, you may put it on the bottom of its owner's library. So we don't actually have to do that, we can allow that spell to resolve. Also, it does say this ability triggers only once each turn. Now that does not specify just during our turn, so it does count opponents' turns as well. So obviously keep that in mind with something like an instant like a Brainstorm you can utilize on an opponent's turn to potentially cast something massive off the top of your library. That being said, of course, cheap sorceries can really help us out as well with this deck with cards like Portent, Preordain, and Serum Visions. Portent is going to have us look at the top 3 cards of target player's library and put them back in any order, and we can have the player shuffle, and we draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. Preordain is going to have us scry 2, then draw a card, and Serum Visions does the opposite, draw a card, then scry 2. We're not quite done with playing with the top of our library just yet, though, because we also have Telling Time and Otherworldly Gaze. Telling Time lets us take the top 3 cards of our library. One of them is going to go into our hand, one goes on top of our library, and one goes on the bottom of our library. And then Otherworldly Gaze lets us look at the top 3 cards of our library. We can put any number of them into our graveyard and the rest back on top in any order, and we can flash it back for 1 and a blue. So this can actually help us set ourselves up multiple times. But now that we've talked about setting ourselves up and knowing what the top of our library is, well, what are some things that we really want to hit? How about some massive creatures with cards like Atali Primal Storm, Diluvian Primordial, and Octavia? Atali has, whenever it attacks, exile the top card of each player's library, then you may cast any number of spells from among those cards without paying their mana cost. This can be a massive card. With just one swing, this can absolutely change the game. And keep in mind, of course, when we are utilizing cards and we know what the top of our library is, well, that can really set ourselves up with this. Next up, we've got Diluvian Primordial, which has an incredible ETB. When it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, you may cast up to 1 target instant sorcery card from that player's graveyard without paying its mana cost. And then Octavia is a massive 8/8 that can also turn our other creatures into massive 8/8s. It has Ward 8 and says whenever you cast or copy an instant sorcery spell, target creature has base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. So even our commander, which just has 2 power normally, can become a massive heavy hitter. Moving on though, how about Triplicate Titan, a 9/9 with Flying, Vigilance, and Trample that, when it dies, basically splits into 3 3/3s with one of each of those keywords. Or how about Curse of Unbinding, which says enchant player, at the beginning of enchant player's upkeep, the player reveals cards to the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. Put that card on the battlefield under your control. This can be a great way to either, get massive creatures out of an opponent's library if we're playing against someone that has, massive creatures in their deck, or just put this on ourselves and get our massive creatures out for free. And speaking of creatures, well, we can also utilize our opponent's creatures, or, more of ours, with Clone Legion. It says for each creature target player controls, put a token on the battlefield that's a copy of that creature. So yeah, that can be a game-changing play. And with a massive spell like that one, well, we can double up with cards like Double Vision and Swarm Intelligence. Double Vision's going to copy the first instant sorcery spell we cast each turn, and Swarm Intelligence does it for every single instant sorcery we cast. Both of which are massive effects, especially when you consider that when we do utilize our commander's trigger, we are losing out on that spell that we cast. Now, obviously replacing with potentially something even better, but yeah, with one of these 2 in play, we essentially don't lose out on that spell because we get the copy. And speaking of copies though, there's Tomb of Horrors Adventure, a 4/4, and when it enters the battlefield, we take the initiative, and whenever we cast our second spell each turn, we copy it. On top of that, if we've completed a dungeon, we copy that spell twice, and we choose targets for the copies. Even when just copying any of our spells once, that is a huge effect. And again, remember that, if we're copying permanents, we get a token copy of that permanent too. But yeah, with this one, again, with our commander, if we cast a spell and we utilize that with our commander's trigger, our second spell is going to be whatever we hit off the top. So essentially, we could end up casting, like a 1 mana spell and then end up actually just utilizing that with our commander, flip over cards until we hit, again, something like a Swarm Intelligence and get 2 copies of it thanks to this, which would just be absurd. Or again, 3 copies if we completed a dungeon. Or how about getting a card like Wizard's Spellbook, which is an artifact that says tap exile target instant sorcery card from a graveyard, roll a d20, activate only as a sorcery. 1 through 9 will let us copy the card and cast it. 10 through 19 will let us do the exact same thing, but just pay 1 to actually cast that spell. And if we get a 20, well, We copy each card exiled with Wizard's Spellbook, and we can cast any number of the copies without paying their mana cost. This can be a fantastic way to get additional value out of spells, and also if we happen to get lucky and hit that 20, yeah, look out opponents. And speaking of things our opponents should look out for, we are also going to be running some Eldrazi with Bane of Balaged, Ulamog's Crusher, and Artisan of Kozilek. When Bane of Balaged attacks, the defending player has to exile 2 permanents they control. And then Ulamog's Crusher has Annihilator too, which means that whenever it attacks, the defending player sacrifices 2 permanents. And Ulamog's Crusher has to attack each combat if able, but yeah, we're going to be fine with that, it being an 8/8. And of course, Artisan of Kozilek is a 10/9 that has Annihilator too, so it can also just demolish our opponent's boards. And on top of that, when we cast it, we can return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. And keep in mind, when we hit it with Neera's trigger, we still cast it, so we get that trigger as well. Yeah, Eldrazi like these can be pretty brutal, especially when they've got things like Annihilator, and yeah, that's just gross. Speaking of gross, we also have Desolation Twin, a 10/10 for 10 that says when you cast a spell, create a 10/10 colorless Eldrazi creature token. Just imagine, again, casting a 1-mana instant on an opponent's turn, and then flipping over into this. Again, we get to cast it, so we get 20 total power over 2 bodies, again, for just, a 1-mana spell potentially. Now, as scary as Eldrazi are, there are some things that we might hit that our opponents might be even more scared of. Because, of course, we can run some Chaos in this deck with cards like Chaos Wand and Wand of Wonder. Chaos Wand has pay 4, tap, target opponent exiles card to the top of their library until they exile an instant sorcery card. You may cast the card without paying its mana cost. And then Wand of Wonder is somewhat similar, but basically we roll a d20 and we make each opponent do the exact same thing, exiling till they hit an instant sorcery. If we roll a 1 through 9, we get to cast one of those. 10 through 19, we cast 2 of them. And if we roll a 20, we cast all 3. So yeah, we can get a lot of value out of these. That being said, of course, we've got even more chaotic cards that we're going to be running in this deck with cards like Scrambleverse, Warp World, and Whims of the Fates. Now, I will note that certain playgroups out there are not okay with these chaotic cards, so please check with your playgroup ahead of time, but yeah, these can be some incredibly impactful cards that can really turn a game on its head. Scrambleverse says for each non-land permanent, choose a player at random, then each player gains control of each permanent they were chosen. Untap those permanents. Warp World says each player shuffles all permanents they own into their library that reveals that many cards from the top of their library. Each player puts all artifact, creature, and land cards revealed this way onto the battlefield, then does the same for enchantment cards, then puts all cards revealed this way that weren't put on the battlefield on the bottom of their library. And then Whims of the Fate says, starting with you, each player separates all permanents they control into 3 piles, then each player chooses one of their piles at random and sacrifices those piles. Again, these are game-changing, chaotic cards that can really flip a table on its head. And again, please, disclaimer, make sure to check with your playgroup ahead of time before playing cards like these. Moving on though, let's talk about some draw spells that can help us out with cards like Opt, Read the Runes, and Epiphany the Drownyard. Opt's gonna have a scry 1 and draw a card. Read the Rune says draw X cards for each card you draw this way. Discard a card, let's sacrifice a permanent. And Epiphany the Drownyard is basically an X spell that is a factor fiction. Well, reverse factor fiction. Because we're gonna reveal the top X plus 1 cards of our library and separate them into 2 piles, and opponent chooses one of those piles, we get that pile into our hand, the other into our graveyard. The thing is with these X spells though, is that they are instants that we can technically just cast for a single mana, not having to put anything into that X. So yeah, if we want to utilize these on an opponent's turn, to actually just utilize our commander's trigger, we can. Now, as good as many of these spells are in this deck, there is one card that stands above the rest, in my opinion, and that is the Golden Pig of this deck. So the Golden Pig of this deck, the number 1 card out of her 99 is Jorian Ruin Diver. Jorian is a 2/3 Merfolk Wizard for 1 blue red, and she has, whenever you cast your second spell each turn, draw a card. So with this commander, essentially, this is just pure card advantage every single time we utilize our commander's trigger. Again, we cast a spell, we say, okay, I'm going to actually put that on the bottom of my library, and then we get another spell off the top of our library for free, which we then cast, and Jorian is going to say, hey, that's your second spell, and here's a card. And of course, this can trigger on every single turn, just like our commander. So yeah, essentially with each trip around the table, this can draw us up to 4 cards. This can provide us with an absurd amount of card advantage throughout the game, and it can help us really keep our hand full, and that is why it is the Golden Pig of this deck. But of course, we also have some other cards that can really help us out with card advantage with cards like Wave Break, Hippocamp, Mind, Unbound, and Thought Reflection. The Hippocamp says, whenever you cast your first spell during each opponent's turn, draw a card. Mind Unbound has at the beginning of your upkeep, put a lore counter on Mind Unbound, then draw a card for each lore counter on it. And Thought Reflection is just going to straight up double our card draw. So again, each of these can provide us a lot of card advantage throughout the game as well. But now that we've talked about our game plan, let's talk about some other ways to throw wrenches into our opponent's game plan. First up, we've got some bounce spells with Alchemist Retrieval, Depart the Realm, and Expel from Vraska. Alchemist Retrieval we can cast for just a single mana unless we're targeting one of our opponent's things. And then Depart the Realm is going to have us bounce target non-land permanent, and we can foretell it for just a blue. And then Expel from Vraska is going to bounce a non-land permanent, but if we've got the City's Blessing, we can put it on top of its owner's library instead. Next up, we've got Fading Hope, which is going to bounce target creature back to its owner's hand, and if its mana value is 3 or less, we scry 1. And then Bluster Squall is going to tap down a creature we don't control, or we can overload it for a 3 and a blue, and when we do, well, we're going to tap down every single creature we don't control. And again, keep in mind with these 1 mana instant speed spells, these can be fantastic with our commander's trigger. But of course, we've got some bigger effects with Aether Gale, River's Rebuke, and Magmatic Force. Aether Gale is going to bounce 6 target non-land permanents back to their owner's hands. River's Rebuke is going to bounce every single non-land permanent target player controls back to their owner's hands. And Magmatic Force says, at the beginning of each upkeep, and yes, that includes our opponent's upkeep, deal 3 damage to any target. This can dish out a ton of damage, taking out a lot of creatures, or, just pinging players to the face. But of course, we're not quite done with throwing a wrench to our opponent's plans just yet. So we're also going to be utilizing some low-to-the-ground cards like Giant's Amulet and Mysium Skin. Giant's Amulet is going to give equipped creature +0/+1 in Hexproof as long as it's untapped. So yeah, on our commander, basically Hexproof because we're probably not going to be swinging too often with a 2/7. And then Mysium Skin says, target creature you control gets +0/+1 and gains Hexproof until end of turn, and we can overload it for just 1 in a blue. Finally, we're also going to be utilizing cards like Spell Pierce and Izzet Charm, which can be great counter spells. Counter target non-creature spell its controller pays 2. Izzet Charm actually has some other modes that we can choose though. It can deal 2 damage to our creature, or we can draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. But now that we've gone through every single non-land card in this deck, let's talk about the lands. And first, okay, well, we've got some MDFC lands, which are, lands on the back, but yeah, we're just going to count them in the land section. Regardless, Jwari Disruption, Bane Veil, and Selene Vision can help us out. Jwari Disruption is going to counter target spells controller pays 1. Bane Veil says creature opponents control get -2/-0 until end of turn, and Selene Vision is going to let us look at the top 6 cards of our library, and we get an instant sorcery card from among them into our hand. But yeah, just keep in mind, though, that even lands like these can actually help us out with our commander's trigger. So we're also going to be running Spikefield Hazard, which can deal 1 damage to any target, and if a permanent dealt damage displayed would die this turn, exile it instead. Regardless, 1 mana instant speed spell that we can switch for something potentially much larger. Yeah, sign me up for that. Next up though, we've got some more normal land cards with Command Tower, which can tap for either of our colors, and Exotic Orchard, which can tap for them most of the time. Then we've got 3 lands that can be sacrificed to get one of our basics into play. Tapped in, Maestro's Theater can actually gain us 1 life when it does so. And then Mirrored Landscape can actually help ramp us. Temple Epiphany is going to enter the battlefield tapped, and when it does, we scry 1, and it can tap for either of our colors. And Izzet Boilerworks also enters the battlefield tapped. It's going to bounce land we control back to our hand, but it can tap for both of our colors. And finally, the rest of the deck is made up of islands and swamps. But now that we've talked about every single card in this deck, let's talk about the price. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, every single card in this deck is less than $1, so it's a very budget-friendly deck with an estimated cost coming in at just $30.12. And actually, keep in mind that you might be able to save even more if you've already got the basic lands for this deck, because in this estimated cost, those lands are being counted at 10 cents a piece. And speaking of potential savings, you might be able to save even more by buying this deck on TCG Player and utilizing heavily played and damaged cards, which of course need a home too. That being said, do keep in mind that this estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support.